Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's graphics card performance comparison. Today we are testing 4 different graphics cards. The RX 570 4GB card against the GTX 1060 3GB card, the RX 580 8GB card against the GTX 1060 6GB card. Now these cards range in price from about $170 to about $250 when I'm filming this in 2017. There will be links in the video description below to both Amazon and Newegg for all 4 sets of graphics cards. By all means, compare prices and buy it where it makes the most sense to you. All 4 cards were installed in the same computer. It's my $1,500 i7 7700K build running at a fixed 4.7 GHz on all 4 cores. Link to that build video in the video description below. Fraps was used for the frame performance numbers you will see at the end of this video, but it was not used to capture any of this video. Instead, AMD's Relive and NVIDIA's Shadowplay were used to record the gameplay you're watching. Add 5% on average if you're not recording, but if you're live streaming or recording, this is exactly the performance you can expect to get. Finally, the numbers in green at the top left corner of the screen are from MSI Afterburner, a free program you can download and use to monitor your system's performance in real time while playing games. This is a very handy tool to figure out what is the limitation to your system's performance. Is it your CPU, your RAM, your graphics card? I use this all the time, and if you want to find out what the bottleneck or limit in your system is, I recommend you do so as well. First up, we have the RX 570 graphics card. Now, as I mentioned on the title card earlier, we're playing this at 1440p resolution. This game came out in late 2015, and at 1080p, none of these cards are challenged, even at ultra detail. So we're at 1440p at ultra. Watch the real-time frame rate. It's the 5th line in the MSI Afterburner numbers. You'll notice that it's not quite 60 frames per second. It will jump up and down quite a bit. Now, I will have 1% lows and 0.1% lows at the end of this video in the chart, and I'll talk about what those mean later in the video. But in short, this does a really good job considering that this is the least expensive RX 570 on the market. This is an important point. If you've not watched my other 4 graphics card comparisons, the 570, 580, and 2 1060s, briefly, this is a single fan Sapphire Mini ITX card. It's the least expensive card on the market. It's single fan, and its design does not give it great cooling. You'll notice we're running right at about 70 degrees Celsius, just under. The fan's turning at over 1500 RPM, and watch the clock speed. Top line, last number, you'll see that it's not stable. This will be reflected in the numbers at the end of this video, but I'm pointing this out because I did not manually turn the fan up. Notice it's only spinning at 43%. That's what the 43% in that top line is. Now, why am I testing this card? Because I want to show sort of the bottom end of the market and what's possible. Every other RX 570 is likely to be better than this. Furthermore, you can make this card better as well. All you have to do is manually turn that fan up to about 60%. The plus side is you'll get a much more stable around 1200 megahertz clock speed, the temperature will be about 10 degrees cooler, and your frame rate performance will be smoother and more stable. The downside is the card becomes audible at that point. Right now at 43%, this card is very silent. Now this isn't supposed to be a specific card review, but this is the first RX 570 I've done extensive testing with, and I think it's worth pointing out why the performance is where it is. It's so easy to simply slap a label on a video and say, here's RX 570, that's it, they're all the same. They're not. I have an RX 570 Asus Republic of Gamers factory overclock card that runs at 1300 megahertz fixed out of the box. It has 2 fans, it's fairly quiet, and it is noticeably faster than this. So why am I not testing it here? Because in April of 2017, when I'm filming this video, that graphics card is $190. For $10 more, you can get an RX 580 4GB card, which is a solid 10% again faster. That card is pointless at $190. Now, if you can get A 1300 megahertz RX 570 in the $170, $180 range, oh, it's worth considering. At $190, no, you might as well just buy a 580. I'm testing this because at $170, it's a low enough price relative to the 580s to be worth considering. To be completely honest, at the current price structure on the day I'm actually recording this at the end of April, none of the 570s make a lot of sense. The 580s, even the 4 gig makes a lot more sense. But if you remember back, if you don't, that's okay. But if you remember back to when the RX 470 launched, it didn't make any sense when it first launched either, but very quickly, within a month or two, the price started dropping. When you watch this video, maybe it's a month from now, maybe it's 2 months from now, if the RX 570s become 150, 160, or maybe less with mail-in rebates, then the equation changes a bit. It all comes down to price to performance. That's why the charts at the end of my videos don't contain like frames per dollar, because those charts would quickly become useless. You'd have to do those calculations constantly as prices and deals get updated throughout the market over time. What I'm trying to do is to give you what the performance is, talk about what pricing is at the time this video was made, and then give you general advice to say, hey, if you can find X at a deal, then it makes sense. Right now, the RX 580s are a better deal for the money than the 570s, but all it takes is a price change for that to flip around and for the 570 to become a deal. The general rule of thumb is that a 580 is about 15% faster than a 570, all things being equal, stock card to stock card. Factory overclocked will affect that another 5 or 10% at most, so you're going to see a performance range between the 570 in this video today and the 580 of more than 15%, because the RX 580 8GB card I'm showing you today is a factory overclocked top of the line card. So you're looking at the very best and the very worst case scenario in the video. Most cards from both lines will fall somewhere in the middle. So I'm showing you the brackets, top and bottom end, and you can assume that most cards will fall somewhere in between those two. I'd like to call your attention to the second line of the MSI Afterburner numbers, 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, while I actually do recommend that most people buy the 8 gigabyte RX 580 at the moment, simply because I believe that at this point in 2017, going forward, more texture memory is going to become valuable, and we're looking at a $30 price difference between the 4 and the 8 gig. At $30, that's a relatively small number. When the 470 and 480s launched, the price difference between the 4 and the 8 gig cards was about $60. At the time in 2016, I didn't think $60 for that difference made sense. In 2017, games have progressed and the price has changed. Now it's $30. At $30 difference, absolutely buy the bigger VRAM card. It simply makes sense at this point. We're now going to transition to the GTX 1060 3 gigabyte card. This is an MSI Gaming X graphics card. It has a factory overclock, and thanks to NVIDIA's GPU Boost 3.0, it auto overclocks itself to almost 2 gigahertz. In fact, almost all of the GTX 1060 and 1070 cards that I've tested, and I've tested many of them, all run around 1950 megahertz, some a little more, some a little less. Look at our fan speed. The biggest difference with this card is the two very large fans, much larger than on the Sapphire card, and a huge oversized heatsink. 740 RPM, 30% fan speed, 10 degrees cooler on the card. This thing is absolutely silent. The reason to buy something like an MSI Gaming X over, for example, maybe the MSI Armor OC, the black and white card, is not performance. The Armor OC and the Gaming X are exactly the same performance. Regardless of what you see in advertising materials or claimed clock speeds, the reality is I have both. Both overclock to the same speeds. Both are going to auto overclock to about the mid 1900 and change megahertz clock speed. However, the Gaming X runs cooler and runs quieter. The fans are physically larger on the Gaming X than they are on the Armor OC, and the heatsink is substantially bigger. The card is heavier, it is taller, it is longer. So that's really what you're getting with the larger fan, larger heatsink cards. Cooler running, lower noise, more so than more performance. Now, some of them are a little bit faster and they have more potential for overclocking. The lower temperatures here give you the potential to maybe get 2 gigahertz even, or maybe even 2.05 or even 2.1. Very few of my NVIDIA graphics cards from the 10 series generation will actually do 2.1, and that's regardless of the cooler. That's a voltage limitation and a chip design limitation. But 2 gigahertz even, they will all do. In fact, I can't think of a single one that hasn't done 2 gigahertz right on the nose. However, you have to go into, for example, MSI Afterburner, which does work with all the cards, not just MSI cards. MSI Afterburner works with all the cards. You'll go in and just type in a plus 65 on the clock speed, and generally you shouldn't have to adjust anything else, and it'll put you right at about 2 gigahertz on most of these cards. Now the next question is, would you notice any real performance difference between 1936 megahertz and 2 gigahertz? No, of course not. You'd be looking at 1, maybe 2 frames a second on average. You're looking at the difference between 75 and 76 frames per second. Even in side-by-side double-blind tests, you're not going to notice 75 to 76 frames per second. Hitting that magical 2 gigahertz number is more a mental thing. It's kind of in your head. It's that magic round number more than it is anything else. Most of the cards I'm showing in these videos, with the exception of the Sapphire card, the single fan mini ITX card, these will all overclock a bit more over the stock speeds. I'm not doing it for the video, however, because I believe the vast majority of people buy these cards, put it in their machine, turn it on, install the drivers, and play games. The number of people who actually download MSI Afterburner and manually overclock the cards is probably in the low single digits. The next number I'd like to draw your attention to is the fourth line, the main system RAM usage. We're currently using 9 gigs of RAM. I have said over and over in this video series that for 2017 for AAA gaming, I highly recommend 16 gigs of RAM. Now, will this game run in 8? Yes, but Windows will have to use RAM compression to fit some stuff in there, and it'll be swapping to your hard drive or your SSD. Your average frame rate will not suffer a lot. You might lose 2 to 4 frames per second overall. And look at this, we're getting over 80 frames a second. You'd never notice the average. What you will notice is lower minimums. You'll notice more dips and stutters. As Windows has to compress the system RAM, as it has to then swap, ouch, that's going to hurt, as it has to swap to your hard drive or SSD, latency and stutters are introduced. Now, even if you have a really fast solid-state drive, it's still 100 times slower than your main system RAM, not just in transfer rate, which it is substantially slower, but also in latency access time. Main system RAM is phenomenally faster than even the best solid-state drives on the market. So, if you are going to be playing games such as Star Wars Battlefront, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Battlefield 1, Rise of the Tomb Raider in 2017, you really should have 16 gigs of RAM, full stop. Many people have asked me, well, why don't you do a video showing the two difference between each other? Well, here's my take on things. If you have a reasonably modern computer, the price difference between 8 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of RAM is $50. If you have the money to buy a $200 to $300 graphics card, a several $100 monitor, a several $100 CPU, you got a $1,000 gaming machine, it's really nice, and yet you're not going to put 16 gigs of RAM in, well, frankly, that's your choice. I mean, at the end of the day, it's your computer and your money to spend any way you want. But you're looking at 5% of the cost of a $1,000 machine, and you're going to end up with more stutters and more latency. I have tried it. I haven't made a video about it. My take on it is if you're currently using 9 gigs of RAM and there's nothing else loaded on the machine, then there's absolutely no excuse to only have 8 gigs of RAM. Please note, this i7 here is a test computer. This is not a personal machine with 10 different programs running in the background and web browsers open and music playing and anything else going on. This also doesn't have 100 different programs run, and it's not used on a daily basis. This i7 is a benchmark machine. It sits on the shelf. If you've watched some of my recent videos with the Masterbox 5 case in the background sitting on the desk behind me, that's the i7 machine. It just sits there. This is a pure test machine with a clean install of Windows that doesn't do anything but run benchmarks. Now, my main machine, my daily driver, is my Ryzen 7 1700. I'm not currently doing benchmarks on it because it would not be fair to test that machine, which does have dozens of programs on it, which is used constantly for personal and business use. So if I ever go back to doing Ryzen 7 1700 benchmarks, I'll either use my 1700X, my 1800X, Or I'll take that 1700 out and put it in a machine with a fresh install of Windows 10. Nothing else would be fair or reasonable, so I don't benchmark on personal machines. Moving on from the GTX 1060, let's take a look at the 8GB RX 580. Now this is an awesome card at a equally expensive awesome price. This is the Gigabyte Aorus RX 580 8GB overclocked card running at 1425 MHz. Look at the temperature, look at the fan speed on this card. This will not deviate from 1425. It has no problem running. That's nearly a 100 megahertz overclock. Not quite, but the base speed of an RX 580 is 1340 megahertz. There are 1340 megahertz RX 580s. This is solid at 1425. And I'm not running it in overclock mode. You can run this card faster. 1500 is doable on this card. The performance difference between the base speeds of RX 570s and even entry-level RX 580s is noticeable and it is real. But don't get carried away thinking that this is the deal. The reason to buy this card is not necessarily the card's performance. It's the RGB lighting. It's the big oversized fans that are virtually silent. While it does say the fans are spinning at over 1300 RPM, let me assure you this card is silent as silent can be. Because the fans are larger, their speed is spread out over a larger area. There's a huge oversized shroud around these fans. I had this computer on the desk next to me like 2 feet away when I was playing this game. The only noisy thing in my i7 tower is the 120mm liquid cooler. It certainly is not this graphics card. This graphics card will run at 1500 megahertz. But as I said before, I run it on the out-of-the-box configuration because I think that's what most people do. I want you to think, well, this is the least I'll get. This is what I'll get guaranteed. I might get more. I don't want to show you 1500 and then have you be disappointed if your particular card doesn't reach that. Please note that the out-of-the-box speed is guaranteed by the manufacturer. Any additional overclocking is not. You might get more, you might not. It depends upon the random sampling of the chip you get because each one is going to reach a different maximum speed. Now, overclocking this is even simpler than overclocking the NVIDIA cards. In the NVIDIA cards in MSI Afterburner, you use an offset. You type, say, a plus 65 or a plus 50 or a plus 75 to add to their clock speed. On the RX cards, you type in the total number you want. So you would type in 1500 or 1475 or 1450 or whatever number you want to try. So it's simply a difference of how you get to the end result. The NVIDIA cards are an offset, whereas this is an absolute. You just type in the actual clock speed that you want to reach. You do have the option of playing with voltages and power delivery and temperature limits. You can also increase the fan speed. Now notice that we're at 72 degrees. I mentioned this is completely silent. If you turn the fan speed up to 60%, the fans become mildly audible. Not much, a little bit, not much. But the temperature drops by about 10 degrees Celsius. However, I don't think 72, 73 degrees is a problem. It's designed to run at these speeds. This is the temperature limit out of the box. If you have a smaller case that produces less airflow, the fan profile curve will ramp the fan speed up automatically up to about 60%. To go beyond that, you'd have to do it manually, but this is why you want a good mid-tower case for these higher factory overclock cards. That's a cool shot of the AT-AT Walker, isn't it? I personally think the AT-AT Walker is going a little slow for my taste, but it's still really cool. I would be terrified if one of those things was walking towards me in real life. It'd be like, holy smokes, run, Forrest, run. There's a walking tree coming at us, and it's got blasters, and it looks mean, and it probably has Darth Vader in it. In any case, my understanding from the extended universe, and some of which is canon and some of which is not, is the AT-AT Walkers on flat and even ground, which I suppose is not the case in the Battle of Endor, but on even flat ground, AT-AT Walkers can do 60 kilometers an hour, which is just under 40 miles an hour. That's pretty fast for a walking tank, considering it's on legs and not on tracks or wheels. However, in this terrain, okay, fair enough, it might be a little bit slower. Of course, if my wife were sitting here, she'd make the point saying, wait a minute, you're having a discussion about the walking speed of a fake, not real, walking tank machine? Yeah, honey, it's Star Wars. Don't worry about it. One thing I haven't talked about much so far is the CPU usage. Take a look at line 3, our i7-7700K. you will see that virtually all the time during this test on all 4 cards we're below 50% usage. Now the i7 is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU. So if we're under 50%, that generally means an i5 CPU is going to provide the same performance, and it will. Star Wars Battlefront generally does not need an i7, and i5 is fine. That being said, the clock speed does make a difference. Now we're running at 4.7 gigahertz. If you have an i5 7600K overclocked to 4.7, you should expect to see basically the same results. Now if you have an i5 6400 running at a max of 3.3 gigahertz, you may actually run into a CPU limitation at some point. High frame rates, in general, not always, but in general, high frame rates of 100 plus frames per second require lots of CPU power. All the graphics card in the world is not going to give you 120 or 150 frames per second if it's paired with a 3 gigahertz processor. On the other hand, if you want high frame rates, you do have to make sure you have enough GPU power. Your game is basically going to run at whatever limit it reaches first, CPU or GPU. One of those two things will limit any further performance. Now, if you look at the percentage of our graphics card, you'll see that it maintains 100% usage most of the time, but not all. Several times throughout this run, the percentage drops down into the 70 to 80% range, but only for a second or two before it jumps back up. Clock speed does matter. Core count matters less for most existing games on the market. Now, this game is a year and a half old. Newer games, Battlefield 1 for example, will use more than 4 threads, and an i7 does make a difference for them. An i5 CPU overclocked is fine, but really if you don't want to go with an i7 7700K, my recommendation would be a Ryzen 5 chip. The Ryzen 5 1500X or the Ryzen 5 1600 overclocked with a good cooler if you're okay to overclock it, or a Ryzen 5 1600X if you'd rather not, would also be excellent choices. Both of those CPUs run around 4 gigahertz and will give you really close to this level of performance. Not quite, because this is 4.7 and those chips aren't quite up to running at that clock speed, but it's close enough for most situations. It is worth noting that the price is the other huge difference. A Ryzen 5 1500X will run up to 3.9 gigahertz out of the box with XFR auto overclocking without having to make any changes to the system whatsoever. 4 cores, 8 threads, just like this i7. The only difference is the clock speed and the instruction rate. Now with this chip at 4.7, it's absolutely faster, but it costs a whole lot more money. This is a $350 processor with a $90 liquid cooler bolted onto it. So we're at $440, not even counting the cost of the motherboard. $150 for a nice Z270 motherboard, and you've got an expensive computer. Compare that to $190 for a 1500X. Use the included Wraithspire cooler. It's good enough at the stock speeds it comes out to, up to 3.9 gigahertz out of the box. Combine that with an inexpensive $80 to $100 B350 motherboard, and you've got yourself a heck of a deal. No, it's not as fast as this processor, but the total platform cost, cooler, CPU, and motherboard, is about half the price of this i7. So if you get about 80 to 85% of the performance for 50% of the money, that's a deal. Now that does not in any way make the i7 a bad chip. It's an awesome processor, and if you have an i7, enjoy it. You've got a great chip that will last you for many years to come. But I think that with the Ryzen 5 processors out, the i7 becomes sort of an exclusive chip reserved to one market segment and one market segment only: high refresh rate gamers. Do you have a 144 Hz monitor and you want to play modern current games at 144 frames a second? You really need an i7 7700K. You need to overclock it on a good liquid cooler, or perhaps a big tower cooler such as one of the $80 to $100 Noctua coolers. And you really need a high-end graphics card. If you want to do high refresh rate gaming, I wouldn't buy an RX 580 or a GTX 1060. I'd be on at least a 1070, if not a 1080, even at 1080p, much less 1440p. Expensive, yes, but if you want to play with the best, then you got to bring the money to do so. The deal is 1080p, 60Hz gaming, 60 frames per second on a Ryzen 5 1500X or 1600 paired with one of these $200 graphics cards. You'll get smooth, solid, stable performance in all current games on the market without any issues at high detail or better, and you'll spend a whole lot less money than trying to play at 1440p at 144 frames per second, which basically takes everything you can throw at it. It is worth noting that 1440p at 144 Hz is actually substantially harder to do than 4K at 60 Hz. The number of pixels per second is about 25% higher than 4K, and you need monster CPU power to drive that many frames because the CPU still has to generate the triangles and the outlines and the collision detection and the AI and all the physics behind the game engine is generally all still run on the CPU itself, not the graphics card. The graphics card just makes it pretty. The CPU tells the graphics card what to draw. And to tell the graphics card what to draw 144 times per second basically takes all the CPU you can possibly throw at it. Briefly, let me talk about this GTX 1060 6GB card here before we jump to the results. This is an EVGA dual fan for the win 1060 6GB card. I have previously covered this in my updated 2017 Which GTX 1060 Should You Buy. At the time, I said don't bother with the For the Win or even the super clocked card, which looks almost exactly the same. Just buy the straight super clocked single fan card. Now that advice generally holds true. It's fine. There's no performance difference between the two. The only main difference is the superclock card has a little bit less potential overclocking, and it's going to run a little bit louder because the fan speed has to turn faster because there's only one fan. What has changed? Price. You can now find the For the Win 1060 for only about $10 to $15 more than the superclocked. Want two fans? Want a cooler running card? Want the ability to maybe overclock another 50 or 100 megahertz faster because you can turn those fans up? Look, the fans are only turning at 33%. These could easily be put at 50% and this card would still be very, very quiet. So if you want that ability, an extra $10 or $15 shouldn't break the bank. Buy the For the Win. It's a very, very nice card. Or the superclocked. They're both lovely. But honestly, I'm including the For the Win here simply because I haven't covered it much. I haven't shown it much, and the new lower price gives me a chance to feature it here in these game performance videos rather than the superclocked, which I have covered endlessly in prior videos. The last thing I'll draw your attention to is the VRAM usage, 3.7 gigabytes of VRAM, second line on MSI Afterburner numbers. A lot of people will look at that and go, well, see, clearly I have to get a 6GB card. 3 gigabytes is no longer enough to game in 2017. It just won't cut it. It'll stutter, it'll be slow, it'll be terrible. Really? Didn't you just watch the 3 gigabyte card play this game and didn't it do it just perfectly? Yes, it did. Here's the reality. Allocated VRAM and needed VRAM are two different things. Many games will allocate and store stuff in extra VRAM if you have it, but they don't actually necessarily run any faster, nor do the minimums actually improve very much. When you look at the numbers at the end of this video, I want you to pay attention to the 1% minimums and the 0.1% minimums. Those are the bottom end of the performance. That's where stutters are going to show up. Frankly, there aren't any. This game does not need more than 3 gigs of VRAM, even at 1440p at ultra detail. Let me be clear, this isn't even 1080p. We're playing at 1440p, which requires more RAM than 1080p. We've got the detail cranked to the max, and there's no stutter issues. But again, this game is a year and a half old. Last year, I did a which card should you buy, 3GB or 6GB GTX 1060, and at the time I said seriously, don't bother, just buy the 3GB card. That advice was based on two things. That video was almost a year ago when the prices were different and games were different, and that was based upon the fact, well, prices were different. $60 was the price difference at launch between the 3 and the 6GB card. Currently today in April when I'm filming this, it's only $30 between the 3 and the 6GB card. Plus the 6GB card is 10% faster. For $30, if you can afford it, buy the 6GB card. There's no reason to buy the 3GB card in 2017 when there's only $30 difference. The 6GB card is faster, and frankly, we're only going to need more VRAM going forward. So my previous advice has shifted because the market has shifted. Now that's enough gameplay. Let's go take a look at some results. The green bars on the screen are the average game performance. RX 570, 58 frames per second. RX 580, 75 frames per second. We'll talk about the 1060s in a second. Why is there such a big difference? Remember earlier in the video, I said I have the cheapest, most basic RX 570 here versus the fanciest, fastest, factory overclocked RX 580. I'm bracketing the market. I'm showing you the very top and the very bottom of the market. Most cards will be in between these. The average RX 580 would be closer to 70 frames per second, and the average RX 570 would be more like 65 frames per second. So they'll be closer to each other than this chart would indicate. Briefly, let's look at the two GTX 1060 cards, 66 and 65 frames per second. Now it's different gameplay runs, it's different maps, so they're going to be ever so slightly different. What does this mean? It means that both of those cards play this game just fine. Now the minimums on the 3 gig card are a bit lower, but not by much. I'll talk about that more in a second. Let's go back to the two RX cards. Notice the substantially lower minimum frame rates on the RX 570. If you actually watch the game performance video, you'll notice the clock speed was not stable. It kept dropping. The card was reaching its temp limit. And the default fan profile on this card did not want to spin the fan up. Instead, it dropped the clock speed. You can manually increase the fan speed. I am honestly not a big fan of this card. But unfortunately, it's the cheapest card there is, and if you spend more, such as I mentioned during the video, you might as well buy a 580. I really would recommend a 2-fan RX 570, not this single-fan card. It really produces more heat than I like to see on one of these mini ITX cards. Now, what does the red and the blue bars represent? Briefly, the red bars represent the minimum frame rate you'll see through 99% of your gameplay. The 1% minimum means that 1% of the frames were at or below this, 99% of the frames were at or above this. The blue bar is the same except it's 99.9%, which is really, really close to being the true minimum. There may be 1 or 2 frames below that, but it's really close to the true minimum. Now on the RX 580, notice that our 1% was 61 frames per second. That is a massive difference, but that is largely increased shader count, faster RAM, and mostly the clock speed. A steady 1425 megahertz versus a very unstable clock speed that dipped down below 1000 megahertz at time. Go back and watch the run if you didn't see it, or if you skipped ahead using the timestamps below, watch the run, watch the time. Watch the clock speeds. That's why I put the live game performance. If I just put up a 3-minute video of charts, you'd look at this and go, whoa man, that RX 570 sucks. No. This RX 570 sucks. The Asus Republic of Gamers Strix card is awesome, and it's stable at 1300 megahertz, and it wouldn't have numbers nearly this bad. But it's $190, and $10 more buys you an RX 580, and so it makes no sense, at least at current prices. So I honestly wouldn't recommend the Sapphire Mini ITX card because of this issue. What about the minimums on the two 1060 cards? The 1% minimum, the 99% number, is 50 and 52. Basically, these two cards performed identically. What about the 0.1% minimum? There's a bit more difference. The fact of the matter is, as much as people think you need tons of VRAM for modern games, you generally don't. Most games will cope with less VRAM than you think. Now, 2 gigabytes would not be enough. You do need the 3, but you don't need 4. However, next year, 2018, yeah, you might very well need 4, at least on the latest and greatest games. With a $30 price difference between these cards, frankly, there's no reason to buy the 3 gig card anymore, in my opinion. Buy the 6 gig card. For $30, you're buying yourself future-proofing against needing that extra VRAM, and you're buying yourself 10% more card performance. Even if it isn't reflected in this test, watch my others. It really is about 10% faster. If you did watch the game performance, look back at that GTX 1060. The map I was on had all the snow on the screen. It was probably the worst situation with the weather effects. None of the other 3 maps had the weather effects. So that does affect the performance somewhat. I thought about, after I finished that map, doing another one that wasn't on the weather, because I looked at the performance and thought, yeah, that's actually a little slower. That doesn't reflect what that card can really do. That being said, I can mention it during this video. I can say, hey, we had the snow, we had weather effects. It's a little bit slower than it would have been on the other maps. It's just something that happens when you're playing online multiplayer games where I cannot replicate the exact results every single time. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge button directly below. Post your comments below the video. Check the video description for links to everything. The graphics cards on Amazon and Newegg. If you found this video helpful and useful, be sure to use my links when you go shopping. I'd greatly appreciate it. Finally, my Patreon link is down there. Please consider supporting my channel if you're at all able. I would greatly appreciate it, and every dollar through Patreon goes directly back to the channel to do great performance videos such as these that you see here. How-to guides, build guides, performance videos, tutorials, all sorts of interesting videos. I hope you find it interesting and useful. Finally, there is a link to my Twitter feed down there. If you don't follow me on Twitter, go follow me on Twitter. I post regular deals all the time. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.